welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll be getting into Chapter 2 of Spontaneous Healing by Dr. Andrew Weil. Chapter 2, right in my own backyard. When I finished my South American travels in 1973, I began a long process of settling down in the vicinity of Tucson, Arizona, where I live to this day. I felt a strong affinity with the natural environment of the desert and made good connections with people and places in the area. One of those connections was with Sandy Newmark, a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Arizona, who became one of my neighbors in Espero Canyon in the foothills of Catalina Mountains. Sandy subsequently left anthropology to be a farmer in the White Mountains of central Arizona. Then he returned to Tucson to enroll in medical school. Today, he is my family's pediatrician. Sandy and his wife, Linda, now a clinical psychologist, have a daughter, Sophia, who is developmentally retarded. When Sophia was a baby, many of the Newmark's friends offered suggestions for treatment. One was to take the baby to an unusual osteopathic physician named Robert Fullford, who had a good record of working with children suffering from all sorts of problems. Sandy and Linda were so impressed with him that they took Sophia for a number of his gentle sessions of cranial therapy. And Sandy, then in his first year of medical school at the University of Arizona, worked with Dr. Fullford for a time. He kept telling me I should meet him, but I was not interested, partially due to my ignorance about osteopaths. With the usual prejudices of medical doctors, I considered them to be second-rate MDs who dabbled in a kind of manipulation of the body more frequently done by chiropractors. I was also probably still attached to the romantic notion of finding a healer or teacher in some far-off, very different culture. This despite my repeated experience of coming back empty-handed from trips to remote places. It took many people telling me many times that I had to meet Dr. Fullford before I finally paid him a visit. Bob Fullford was then in his late 70s. He had come to Tucson from Cincinnati in retirement from an overwhelming practice. One night, after spending a year recovering from exhaustion, he received a desperate call from a friend whose baby was severely ill with pneumonia. The baby was in the hospital, not responding to antibiotics. Dr. Fullford went to the hospital, gave hands-on treatment, and the next morning the baby was out of danger. Within hours, people began calling him with requests for treatment, and he found himself drawn inexorably out of retirement and back into the practice of his own special form of osteopathic medicine. I was struck by the simplicity of Dr. Fullford's office, a waiting room with a nurse receptionist and 2 treatment rooms. Except for a diploma from the Kansas City College of Osteopathy on the wall, there was no distinguishing features and none of the equipment normally associated with the medical office. Dr. Fullford appeared kind and grandfatherly. He was tall, strong, and relaxed, with large, wonderful hands. He spoke quietly and sparingly. I told him that I had heard much about his effectiveness and wanted to experience his treatments for myself. "Well, what's wrong with you?" he asked. "Not much," I told him. "My neck's been bothering me a little. Sometimes it gets pretty stiff and sore." "Well, let's see what we can do about it," he said. He asked me to stand, put his hands on my shoulders, and observe my breathing. Then he moved my head in different directions. Just get up here on the table," he directed. I lay on my back and watched him wheel over a stand with a curious instrument on a long power cord. The instrument was his percussion hammer, a modified dentist drill motor with a thick round metal disc that vibrated up and down. Dr. Fullford sat on a stool next to the table, adjusted the vibration rate, and put the disc in contact with my right shoulder. I could feel the vibrations through the whole right side of my body, pleasant and relaxing, but hardly major therapy. After several minutes, Dr. Fullford's hand gave a little jerk and he muttered, "There she goes." With that, he removed the percussion hammer and placed it in a new spot on my right hip. He continued this routine for 20 minutes while I drifted in and out of daydreams. Then he turned off the machine and moved his stool to the end of the table and put his hands on the sides of my head, his fingers around my ears. For the next few minutes, he cradled my head, applying the gentlest of pressure, now here, now there. It was one of the least dramatic forms of body work I had ever felt, so much so that I doubted it could even accomplish anything. At the same time, it felt reassuring to be held by such experienced and confident hands. When this phase of the treatment was over, Dr. Fullford checked the mobility of my limbs, then asked me to sit up. He finished with a few more familiar manipulations to crack my spine. There, that should do it, he said. What did you find? I asked. Not much, he replied. A few little restrictions in the shoulder that were probably causing your neck to get sore. Your cranial impulses are very good. I had no idea what cranial impulses were, but I was glad to hear that mine were good. As for restrictions in the shoulder and how they might cause a stiff neck, I was equally in the dark. But no further explanation was offered, and Dr. Fullford indicated that our time was up. He told me I was welcome to come back anytime and watch him work. I was pleasantly surprised to learn that the charge for this session was only $35. Certainly a bargain, if only for the relaxation it provided. Still, I failed to see how minimal intervention could account for all the stories I had heard about Dr. Fullford's clinical successes. I resolved to come back and watch him treat others. The next day, I was surprised to find that I was fatigued and sore. I called Dr. Fullford to ask if this could be a result of his work. He said, "Oh yes, that's perfectly normal. You might feel it for a couple of days." And so I did. After that, I felt fine, and my neck did indeed bother me less, but I did not notice any other change. About a month later, I began spending a few hours a week in the doctor's little office on Grant Road, watching the old man work with his patients. His office was always full, often with parents and children representing a cross-section of the diverse groups that populate southern Arizona, including Hispanics and Asians, city folk and country folk. All came with high expectations and gratitude just for the chance to see this man. At the least, Dr. Fullford was a wonderful role model of the old-fashioned, caring family doctor who made people feel better just by the warmth of his presence and his own personal example of good health. Observing him, I was surprised by the brevity of his histories and physical examinations. He asked very few questions when a new patient walked in the door. "What's the problem? How long has that been bothering you? Did you ever take any bad falls in your childhood? Do you know anything about the circumstances of your birth?" And maybe a few more. Then he stood people up, checked the patient's limbs and breathing, rotated their heads, and asked them to lie on the table. He administered to most people the same kinds of treatments I received. A slow going over with the percussion hammer, held to various parts of the body until some sort of release occurred, when his hand holding the instrument would jerk suddenly. Then slow, imperceptible hands-on manipulation of the head, and finally a few adjustments of the back. He rarely volunteered explanations of what he thought was wrong or what he aimed to do, but if people asked, he would do so in a few words. Most people did not ask. They just seemed to entrust themselves or their children to the doctor and let him work in silence. Everyone relaxed in Dr. Fullford's hands, even restless, fussy children who would calm down almost as soon as he touched them. Often at the end of the session, he gave people strange daily exercises to perform, exercises that I'd never even seen before. One he had recommended frequently went like this: stand with your feet apart at shoulder's width, and extend the arms to the side fully with the left palm facing up and the right palm facing down. Breathe deeply and regularly, holding this position until the strain in the upper arms and shoulders becomes unbearable. Then, as slowly as you can, raise the arms above your head, keeping them fully extended until the hands touch. Then lower the arms and relax. "What was that supposed to do?" I asked him. "It opens the chest and allows the breath to expand," was the answer. Another Fullford exercise was to sit on the edge of a chair with feet flat on the floor and shoulder width apart, then bend forward and with the arms inside the legs, grasp the bottoms of the feet with the hands. Hold this position for a few minutes and it gently stretches the lower vertebrae, allowing for greater motion of the spine. Sometimes when patients came back, Dr. Fullford, on examining them, would say, "You haven't been doing your exercise," or "Good, you've been doing your exercise," and the patients would confirm that this was so. He often told patients not to come back. "When do you want to see me again?" they might ask as they got off the table. He said, I don't need to see you again," Dr. Fullford would say. "You're fixed." "But I don't need any follow-up," they might persist. Dr. Fullford smiled and shook his head. "I took the shock out of your system," he would say. Now just let old Mother Nature do her job. If there was any disappointment among Dr. Fullford's patients, it had to do with their not having to see him again, since the experience of his treatment was so satisfying. Gradually, I began to realize that I was seeing something quite extraordinary. This old man of strong hands and few words was in fact fixing people who came to him with a wide range of disorders, often in one session of therapy that, on the surface, seemed minimal. I heard tale after tale of long-standing problems resolved after 1 or 2 visits to Dr. Fullford, problems that had not responded to conventional medicine. And these were not just aches, pains, and other musculoskeletal ailments, but also hormonal and digestive disturbances, sleep disorders, asthma, ear infections, and more. How could such undramatic treatment give such dramatic results? I began to ask Dr. Fullford about why and wherefore of his methods. What was the theory behind them? Just what was he doing? The answers I received sounded nothing like I had learned at Harvard Medical School. Bob Fullford was a pure, old-time osteopath in the tradition of the man who founded the system, Andrew Taylor Still, born 1828 and passed away in 1917, of Kirksville, Missouri. A.T. Still, the old doctor to his contemporaries, was a renegade physician who disowned the toxic drugs of his colleagues in favor of a drugless system of therapy based on manipulation of bones. His idea was to adjust the body mechanically in order to allow the circulatory and nervous systems to function smoothly, bringing natural healing power to any ailing part. The new profession that he founded in 1874 was very successful in its early years. But by the middle of the 20th century, it had been eclipsed by the spectacular rise of modern scientific medicine, also known as allopathic medicine. In response, osteopaths abandoned Still's teachings and began to behave increasingly like MDs. Today, the MD and the DO degrees are equivalent. Most osteopaths rely on drugs and surgery, and few use manipulation as a primary modality of treatment. Nevertheless, there has always existed within the osteopathic profession a minor tradition of healers who use no drugs and continue to refine A.T. Still's insights into the nature of the human body and its potential to heal itself. One of those was William Sutherland, who in 1939 announced to his colleagues his discovery of an aspect of human physiology he called the primary respiratory mechanism, and a technique for modifying it that became known as cranial therapy, or craniosacral therapy. Sutherland worked on his theory for many years to ensure its correctness before going public. Nonetheless, it was met with great resistance, and only a small percentage of osteopaths accepted it. One of those was the young Robert Fullford, then just beginning his general practice in Cincinnati. Sutherland's insights was the central nervous system and its associated structures were in constant rhythmic motion, and that this motion was an essential feature, perhaps the most essential feature of human life and health. He identified 5 components of the mechanism: motion at the cranial sutures, the joints linking the 26 bones of the skull; expansion and contraction of the hemispheres of the brain; motion of the membranes covering the brain and spinal cord; a fluid wave within the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, involuntary, subtle motion of the sacrum, tailbone. Sutherland thought that the rhythmic expansion and contraction of this system resembled breathing, but since it was occurring at the most vital and most essential organs, he called it primary respiration to indicate its importance in the hierarchy of body functions and distinguish it from secondary respiration, the familiar motions of the chest, lungs, and diaphragm associated with the exchange of air. It postulated that an intact, freely moving primary respiratory mechanism was necessary to full health. Any restrictions in it could lead to disease, since the central nervous system regulated all other organs. One of the main heresies in Sutherland's formulation was the notion that the cranial bones move. Generations of autonomists had taught that the joints of the skull are fixed and immobile. Not only MDs, but also most DOs refused to consider the idea of cranial motion. Dr. Fullford was not one of them, and he started training himself to feel those motions by putting his hands on people's heads. It is only in recent years that researchers at Michigan State University's College of Osteopathic Medicine have confirmed Sutherland's theory with X-ray films of living skulls that show cranial motion. Those motions can be measured by sensitive instruments. Bob Fullford would argue that the most sensitive instruments are the hands of a practiced physician. He trained himself to feel a human hair under 17 sheets of paper, and he says that anyone can develop a similar touch sensitivity with enough practice. Under Dr. Fullford's guidance, I began feeling heads myself to see if I could detect cranial impulses. At first, I felt mainly my own pulse, but as I practiced, I began to feel the subtle, breath-like motion that Dr. Fullford considers the most vital expression of life. At least I felt it in people who had well-running primary respiratory mechanisms. Once, he asked me to feel the head of a woman who, he said, had no detectable cranial impulses. She had been in several bad accidents, one 20 years before, and now suffered extreme fatigue, insomnia, migraine headaches, weak vision, poor digestion, and increased susceptibility to infection. Her head felt like a bag of cement, a dead weight, the rhythm of life not present. After several sessions of treatment, her cranial motions began to return, and as they did, her health began to improve. What causes impairment of this system? I asked Dr. Fullford. Trauma was the answer. 3 kinds of trauma. The first is birth trauma. If the first breath of life is not perfectly full, the cranial rhythms are restricted from the start. That first breath is so important. In my lifetime, I've seen problems of this source increase steadily, which I think is a black mark against our obstetrical practices. The second common reason is physical trauma, especially in early life. Any fall or blow that knocks the wind out of you, that causes the breath cycle to be interrupted, even for a moment, can cause permanent, lifelong restriction in the primary respiratory mechanism. It is possible to feel and identify and undo those restrictions with your hands. That's what I call taking the shock out of the body. And a third reason, maybe less common, is major psychological trauma, again, especially in early life. I estimate that 95% of people have restrictions in one degree or another in this function. Around the time that Dr. Fullford was teaching these new concepts to me, I was helping a friend through medical crisis. He directed the World Wildlife Fund project that kept him in the field leading rough, adventurous life, except for the summer months, when the turtles headed out to sea. Then he would come up to Tucson, looking bedraggled, to tell his stories and gather his strength. For several years, he had suffered from intestinal problems, episodes of severe diarrhea in Mexico, inability to digest many foods, and abdominal pain. He would routinely take courses of antibiotics and antiparasitic drugs, but year by year, the episodes became more frequent and more intense. Now he came to me, having lost 20 pounds, saying that he had not had a formed bowel movement in months. that his stool frequently contained blood and mucus, that he had constant abdominal pain and increased debility. He did not think that he would be able to continue in his turtle work. Kim wanted prescriptions to knock out what he thought were more parasites in his gut, but the picture he presented was not one of infection. Instead, he seemed to me to have chronic inflammatory bowel disease, possibly ulcerative colitis, and I urged him to see a highly recommended gastroenterologist at the University of Arizona Health Sciences Center. Kim was the son of a pulmonary surgeon in New York and had great faith in conventional medicine. That faith was tested, however, when, after a long and expensive series of tests culminating in a biopsy of the colon, the gastroenterologist could not identify the nature of the problem, except to say that Kim's colon was severely and chronically inflamed. Ulcerative colitis was definitely a possibility. I think we should go in and take out more tissue, the gastroenterologist told me. Then maybe we'll find out what the hell he's got. This did not sound encouraging, and since Kim was paying for it out of his own pocket, I suggested looking for another approach. Then it occurred to me to send Kim to Dr. Fullford. Kim had a long history of playing contact sports, including boxing, and he had been a heavyweight in the Army and had suffered many traumatic injuries. I noticed that he always breathed through his mouth. In addition to the intestinal problems, he complained of episodes of bad back and neck pain. It seemed to me that Dr. Fullford might be able to make sense of this whole picture, but I foresaw two problems. The first was that Dr. Fullford was now only seeing patients under 30, a limit that he imposed because his practice was again getting out of hand as his reputation grew. "I'm almost 80, he said to me one day, and I can't work for myself to exhaustion anymore. My energies go further with young folks. Their healing responses are stronger." He had invented the percussion hammer to make things easier on himself, too. What it accomplished could be done by hand, he said, but with much more effort. A second problem was that Kim, having grown up with conventional medicine and lacking any experience with alternative practitioners, might be reluctant to trust himself to one. I did my best to explain both to Dr. Fullford and Kim why they should see each other, and I succeeded, except that Kim couldn't see how an osteopath was going to help his colon. "Just tell him all your symptoms," I urged. "All the intestinal symptoms as well as the pains in your back and neck." I was unable to be in the office that day and waited expectantly to see Kim when he came home. "He's a quack," were Kim's first words. "I mean, he's a nice old man, but he doesn't do anything." "What did he tell you?" I asked. "He said I was in critical condition and that my cranial motions were completely shut down because of old injuries, and that the cranial nerve controlling the digestive system was not functioning as a result. Also that the same injuries make me breathe through my mouth, and that doesn't nourish my brain as breathing should." "Did he say he was able to help you?" "He said he took care of most of it and that I should come back in 3 weeks. But he seemed so feeble, and he's got all these nervous tics. I felt sorry for him. At least it didn't cost much." "What do you mean by nervous tics?" I asked. "You know, when he has that vibrator on you, every few minutes his hand flies up in the air and his whole body jerks." "Really?" "Yes, it's kind of sad." I called Dr. Fullford for his view of the session. "Mr. Clifton came in not a moment too soon," he told me. "His whole primary respiratory mechanism was shut down. I think he would really have gone downhill fast." "Were you able to help him?" "Oh yes, I got major releases from many parts of his body, undid a lot of the trauma, and got the impulses flowing again. Once the vagus nerve kicks in, he'll be all right. He should just take it easy now and let old Mother Nature do her job." 6 hours after the treatment, Kim's diarrhea stopped for the first time in 8 months, never to return. Over the next 3 months, he regained all of his lost weight and energy. The back and neck pain disappeared, and he stopped breathing through his mouth. "He saved my life," Kim later told me. "I'm convinced that man saved my life. He has since become a passionate convert to alternative medicine in general, and osteopathy in particular. This cure was so impressive that I tried to arrange a conference to discuss the case with Dr. Fullford, Kim, myself, and the university gastroenterologist. The doctor said he was interested, but failed to show. When I asked him why, he told me, "Look, I'm not going to argue with success, but I can't believe that osteopathic treatment had anything to do with the outcome." Shortly afterward, I had another opportunity to witness Dr. Fullford's skill with the human body, this time firsthand. I was working in my garden with a friend. In a freak accident that I could never reconstruct, he stood up as I bent down, and his shoulder hit me hard on the right side of my face, just forward of my ear. There was a sharp pain, and I could neither open nor close my mouth fully. It just felt as if my jaw were partially dislocated, and I couldn't get it to go back no matter what I did. I called Dr. Fullford and told him what happened. "Get on down here," he said. I drove myself to his office and walked in, still in pain and still unable to make my jaw work. He made time in his lineup of patients and told me to get on the table. As soon as he put his hands on my head, he named the bone in the skull that was out of place. Then he began the gentlest of manipulations. After a few minutes, he said, "There, it's back." I felt nothing happen and no change in the discomfort. He said I could get up. "It still hurts," I said, disappointed. "Oh, the muscles will be sore for a little while," he replied. "Well, I've got to get busy." I left, unconvinced that I had been helped, contemplating a visit to the emergency room at the university hospital. But 10 minutes later, as I was sitting at a stoplight, I suddenly realized that the pain was not there, and that I could open and close my mouth normally. Incredible. Thank you, Dr. Fullford. Then I thought, what would you have done if you didn't know about him? Probably I would have visited an emergency room, undergone x-rays, and been sent home with painkillers, muscle relaxants, and the expectation of a large bill. Possibly I would have remained unhealed for weeks or months. Now I was truly inspired to learn everything I could from Dr. Fullford. I also became increasingly frustrated in trying to explain my excitement to colleagues. Most doctors were no more interested in my stories than the gastroenterologist had been. It was especially annoying to try to talk with pediatricians about the Fullford approach to ear infections in children. Recurrent infection in the middle ear, otitis media, is the bread and butter of pediatricians. So common is it that an ever-growing number of people in our society accept it as a normal part of growing up. The conventional treatments are antibiotics and decongestants, and sometimes surgical placement of tubes through the eardrums to equalize pressure. Commonly, the drug treatments end episodes of infection sooner or later, only for new episodes to recur at frequent intervals. Bob Fullford was outstandingly successful at permanently ending this cycle in young children, often with just one session of treatment in which he concentrated on freeing up the sacrum. "I just beat the heck out of their tailbones," was the way he put it, because he found that at the sacral end of the craniosacral system was often one that was locked up in children, probably from trauma suffered during birth. Here is how he explained the situation. When the sacrum is restricted, the whole primary respiratory mechanism is impaired. Along with this goes a pattern of restricted breathing, and it is the force of the breath, the rhythmic pressure changes in the chest, that pumps the lymphatic circulation. With inadequate lymphatic circulation, there is a poor fluid drainage from the head and neck. Stagnant fluids build up in the middle ear, providing an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. You can wipe out the bacteria all you want with antibiotics, but you aren't going to correct the underlying problem of fluid stagnation. They are just going to come back. Certainly, that is the usual experience of kids, parents, and pediatricians. The bacteria just came back. I saw case after case go through Dr. Fullford's office in which this simple treatment cured otitis media permanently. Often I could see a change in breathing as soon as the child got off the table. Greater, more symmetrical expansion of the chest, deeper breaths. Yet I could not get one pediatrician from the Tucson medical community to come to Dr. Fullford's office and watch. Instead of being interested in my accounts of his treatment, the medical men seemed threatened. Finally, one practitioner, an Englishwoman, agreed to watch. She even sent a patient with such good result that she consented to help me make a documentary film of Dr. Fullford with the Biomedical Communications Department of the University of Arizona. The more I watched Bob Fullford work, the more I was impressed by his own health and vigor. At 80, he was an inspiration for successful aging. Once I asked him for his personal secret of good health. "I'll show you," he said. And with that, he took a deep, slow breath that went on so long that I stared in disbelief. His chest expanded enormously. Then he exhaled as spaciously. The more air you can breathe in and out, the more nourishment you give to the central nervous system, he said afterward. Good breathing is the key. The medicine I saw Bob Fullford practice was the kind of medicine I had longed for during my years of clinical training and my years of wandering. It was non-violent medicine that did not suppress disease, but rather encouraged the body's own healing potential to express itself. Dr. Fullford was the first practitioner I met who adhered religiously to the two most famous admonitions of Hippocrates. First, do no harm. Primum non nocere, and honor the healing power of nature, the vis medicatrice naturae. I learned so much by simply watching him work, being worked on by him, and having informal discussions with him. His answers to my questions were always brief and in ordinary language, unsophisticated by the standards of academic medicine, but bright with wisdom and full of useful practical information. Here are some ideas I took away from my time with him that I have found most useful in my own work as a physician. 1. The body wants to be healthy. Health is the condition of perfect balance, when all systems run smoothly and energy circulates freely. This is the natural condition, the one in which least effort is expended. Therefore, when the body is out of balance, it wants to get back to it. Treatment can and should take advantage of this tendency to return to the condition of health. 2. Healing is a natural power. When Dr. Fullford told patients to relax and let old Mother Nature do her job, he was expressing in a folksy way his great faith in his vis medicatrix naturae of Hippocrates, a concept missing from conventional medicine. Never in my years at Harvard Medical School did anyone mention to me and my classmates, nor do medical school professors talk about it to students today. That seems to be the greatest single philosophical defect of modern medicine. A defect that has immense practical significance since it underlies our inability to find cost-effective solutions to common health problems. My friend Linda Newmark said that Dr. Fullford told her the best thing she could do for her husband, Sandy, while he was in medical school was to take him out in nature for regular walks. He explained to her, he'll need that to balance all the other stuff they're putting into his head. 3. The body as a whole, and all of its parts are connected. Dr. Fullford had a brilliant intuitive understanding of the body as a unified functioning system. When a patient came in complaining of pain in the knee, he did not automatically conclude that the problem was in the knee and proceed to work there. He knew that the knee was the compensating joint for both ankle and the hip. If there is a restriction in the ankle as a result of an old injury, the ankle will not be able to respond as it should to the gravity and motion and will transmit a distorted force up the leg. The knee will compensate for the distortion in order to keep the pelvis in its normal position, and the strain of the compensating effort might be experienced as knee pain. If the knee is locked for any reason, the distortion from the ankle can reach the hip, causing lower back pain. How many knee and back operations were performed, Dr. Fullford wondered, for problems that actually originated in locked up ankles. I saw him cure cases of chronic knee and back pain by unlocking ankles with this percussion hammer. Bob Fullford thought the restrictions he talked about occurred in the fascia, the tough connective tissue that covers muscles and separates spaces inside the body. Anatomists teach that fascia exists as separate sheets, but Fullford worked on the premise that all of the fascia throughout the body is one big convoluted piece. If a restriction occurs anywhere in it, it distorts the fabric of the whole. Hence, local changes can have global effects. Similarly, when Kim Clifton came with his complaints of back and neck pain, mouth bleeding, and chronic bowel disease, Dr. Fullford looked at the whole picture of disturbed physiology and identified a common root in an old traumatic injury of the head. The gastroenterologist who looked only at Kim's colon could make no sense of the problem and had no treatments to offer except drugs to suppress the inflammatory processes in the colon. 4. There is no separation of mind and body. Just as Dr. Fullford believed that psychological trauma could interfere with the respiratory motions of the central nervous system, so also did he presume that physical interventions by their effect on the nervous system could improve psychological function. He regularly raised IQs of learning disabled children by his cranial therapy. In fact, he was so successful at this that a state hospital for developmentally retarded children in Louisiana had him come for a few weeks every year to work on its patients. 5. The beliefs of practitioners strongly influence the healing powers of patients. I'll repeat that because this becomes very important at a later point in this book. The beliefs of practitioners strongly influence the healing powers of patients. Dr. Fullford believed that the patients he treated could get better. He had a simple, genuine, and very beautiful faith in their potential for healing, which he communicated in many ways, both verbal and nonverbal. That was one reason so many people gravitated to him. He was also careful to select those cases he thought he could help. If you had a broken bone, he would tell you, "There's nothing I can do for a broken bone. Let nature heal it, then come to me, and I'll take the shock of the injury out of your system." Neither would he treat problems requiring surgery or other forms of emergency care. As he got older, the demands on him increased steadily. He kept lowering the age limit of patients he accepted. Soon it was 25, then 20. Ideally, he would have liked to restrict his practices to infants because their healing potential is so great and the restrictions have not had time to become fixed in body structures. He also thought all newborns should have prophylactic treatment because so many illnesses in later life are long-term consequences of traumatic birth. And for the first 24 hours of life, the bones are just like jelly. It takes no effort to put them back the way they should be. Dr. Fullford did not succeed with everyone, but he had a higher percentage of successful outcomes than any other practitioner I have ever met. Eventually, the workload became overwhelming, and Bob Fullford, to the great dismay of his patients and followers, announced that he was going into permanent retirement and moving back to Southern Ohio. He did so, but as I write this, he is still, at the age of 90, actively teaching cranial therapy. He travels around the country lecturing, instructing students in technique, and inspiring new generations of physicians to become true doctors. Discovering Dr. Fullford in my own backyard after chasing all over the world was a powerful lesson. I did not have to look out there for what I wanted. Neither do most people have to look out there for healing. Of course, it is worth searching for the best treatment since treatment comes from outside, but healing comes from within, its source in our very nature as living organisms. Part 2. The Faces of Healing, Harvey and Phyllis. In the summer of 1992, when he was 50 years old and 6 months into a happy second marriage, Harvey Sandler developed a disturbing set of symptoms. His vision had become blurred. He would wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. He began to urinate frequently and he became impotent. The last change was the most disturbing because he and his new wife Phyllis had enjoyed a passionate sexual relationship for some time. It got more and more difficult for me to perform, Harvey remembers, so I just stopped coming to bed. he chalked it all up to stress and did not visit a doctor. Phyllis says, I didn't want to pressure him, but after a while it got me down. Harvey's job as a money manager gave him some stress, but in Phyllis's words, really our lives were pretty good. After several months, Harvey sought help from a psychiatrist specializing in sexual dysfunction. She suggested blood tests, one of which, for pituitary hormone, was abnormal. Then an eye doctor ordered an MRI scan of the brain, and this test revealed a tumor directly behind Harvey's eyes. In this location, it was pressing on the hypothalamus, a vital center that controls the pituitary gland, and through it, many involuntary functions of the body. It was also affecting the optic nerves. From its location and appearance, Harvey's doctors thought the tumor was benign, either a glioma or a craniopharyngioma. The former is a solid tumor arising from cells that support neurons. The latter arises from embryonic cells left over from fetal development and tends to be cystic, containing fluid-filled sacs in addition to tissue. It usually appears in people younger than Harvey, but may grow slowly for a long period of time before it reaches a size that affects brain function. The brain is one part of the body where the distinction between benign and malignant tumors is not as immediately important as it usually is. The problem here was a space-occupying lesion, exerting pressure on vital centers in a confined area. It would have to be removed or shrunk. Harvey and Phyllis made the rounds of neurosurgeons in New York. Most were very alarmist about the tumor and prospects for removing it without causing permanent brain damage. Finally, we found one neurosurgeon who told us that what we wanted to hear. Phyllis says, he told us the operation would be a piece of cake and he could have Harvey in and out of the hospital in 2 days. We decided to go with him. The operation took place in November 1992. When exposed, the tumor turned out to be the size of a small egg, situated between the optic nerve and the hypothalamus. The surgeon, unable to remove the tumor because of its location, drained fluid from it to reduce the pressure it was causing and took a sample of the tissue, which identified it as craniopharyngioma. He then sent Harvey for 30 radiation treatments to shrink the tumor, ending just around Christmas. To everyone's dismay, the patient got worse as treatment progressed. His vision deteriorated to the point of near blindness, leaving him unable to read anything or see what was on the television screen. To prevent brain swelling, doctors had prescribed Decadron, a strong steroid. It caused Harvey to gain 40 pounds and changed his personality. He was angry, aggressive, and nasty and slept most of the time, Phyllis says. Harvey says only, I don't remember any of it. He began to lose his memory and his mind. He would get lost in his apartment, describe events that never happened. I didn't know who this person was, Phyllis recalled. According to the doctors, none of this should have happened, and they had no explanation for the deterioration. Nobody would take responsibility for it either, Phyllis says. The surgeon said, I'm only the carpenter here. My job is done. The endocrinologist told us to see the neurologist, and the neurologist told us to see the endocrinologist. I got really scared. About this time, a counselor named Deborah, who is skilled at working with seriously ill people, took Phyllis away for a weekend break, arranging for Harvey's son to come in and care for him. Deborah's brother was a distinguished neurosurgeon in Philadelphia, and he was called in for another opinion. After reviewing the case, this doctor told his sister, Harvey Sandler will never make an independent decision again in his life. He will never recover. You should try to prepare Phyllis to accept his condition. It will be lucky if he stays the same and doesn't deteriorate further. Phyllis became hysterical when Deborah reported this conversation, and as Deborah recalls, Phyllis screamed, There's no way he's not coming back. I said, Okay, I'm with you, but in my heart I didn't believe it. Phyllis returned home feeling she could not afford to waste time. I called all the smartest and best connected people I knew, she said, always asking for help. I told them I had to find one doctor in the world who had done more of these procedures than any other. Well, I got sent on one wild goose chase after another. I talked to doctor after doctor, and finally I found one who seemed right, but he specialized in aneurysms, not tumors. Then the eye doctor called me and said, "Time is of the essence. What vision he has left is going." I dragged my poor husband from doctor to doctor, even though he was exhausted and never wanted to help. Usually I had to dress him and half carry him, and usually he fell asleep in the doctor's offices. Once he wandered out of an office and got lost. Finally, I found a neurosurgeon who was willing to operate, one who had done a lot of these procedures and wasn't put off by such a high-risk case. The second operation to remove the tumor took place in mid-February 1993. Harvey did not wake up for a long time after the surgery. Then he almost died from fluid filling his lungs. On the fourth day after the operation, he lapsed into a coma, and the doctors again were at a loss. It was Phyllis who saved the day. She wondered whether Harvey's coma might be the result of withdrawing him from Decadron too quickly. The drug is used short-term to prevent brain swelling after surgery, but this team of doctors did not know that Harvey had been maintained on very high doses of Decadron since the previous operation. When Phyllis pointed that out to them, they tried giving Harvey some Decadron intravenously. The next morning, he was sitting up and talking. He stayed in intensive care for 2 weeks, in a regular hospital room for another 2 weeks, and then began a long and steady recovery. It took him a whole year to catch up, Phyllis says, and he remained amnesic for the first 3 months prior to the second operation. Slowly he got stronger physically and recovered some of his memory. He had to develop a whole new way of thinking and approaching life. He had to learn what had happened to him, then be frightened about it, and then to be reborn. Deborah remembers Harvey's frustration during this period. Everyone expected him to be transformed by the experience, she recalls, but it seemed that everyone but him got transformed. Harvey had had it all. He was rich, successful, good-looking, enjoying life immensely. His friends were deeply affected by what happened. Almost overnight, he turned into one of life's unfortunates. Brain damaged, overweight, angry and abusive, disoriented with a good chance of dying or being a vegetable. People said if this can happen to him, it can happen to me. It really got people thinking about their vulnerability and motivated them to clean up their acts. Now, after the second operation, the more Harvey heard about the effect he had on others, the more he resented the fact that nothing magical had happened to him. Phyllis spent time every day trying to help Harvey learn to walk again. He would fight with her a lot and remembered her asking him constantly, "So what's different now? How's your life changed as a result of all this?" All he could think to say was, "I just want to get back on the tennis court." About a year after the second operation, the magic happened. In Harvey's words, "I started thinking. I had always let Phyllis do the thinking for me, and I had always shied away from power and responsibility. Now it seemed the tumor and the surgery had reawakened parts of me that had been asleep and at the same time lessened other parts of me. My ability to perform sexually came back 6 weeks after the operation, but my sexuality in general was diminished. I think it had been too dominant before. On the other hand, thinking and emotion increased. In general, I felt more balanced. To make a very long story short, I have assumed responsibility for my life. I'm a more responsible human being now, and I'm using my power appropriately. This illness is one of the biggest gifts I've ever had. On a practical level, my vision is better than it was before, and my memory is excellent. I'm working and playing and living much more the life that I want to live. I've changed my work so that I can stay at home and don't have to go into an office. I play tennis every morning." I also talked to Phyllis about her perspective on the saga. She said, "Throughout the darkest days, I remember thinking, there are going to be gifts coming from this, and I'm going after every one of them. We were very isolated during that period. I didn't let many people into our lives. If I had believed the doctors all knew more than me, I would have accepted their pessimistic outlook and not kept pursuing the possibility of a cure. It's hard to believe that they don't know it all. The surgeon who finally took us on told me that he couldn't guarantee that Harvey would live or have any vision or even recover consciousness. He is as surprised and thrilled at the extent of the recovery as everyone else. A year after the operation, we invited him and his wife to come to dinner and celebrate with us. Really, Harvey has been reborn. He was given a chance to redesign himself, and he's come out a more generous person, someone who is more sensitive to people and wants to be the best person he can be. I've been reborn in the process too. Our adventure has inspired both of us to keep trying to heal the parts of ourselves that are not yet healed. We are still processing it and appreciating it. Phyllis wanted me to know that this is not the first dramatic healing she had witnessed. 7 years ago, I developed excruciating sciatic pain. I had it for 2.5 years and went to more than 20 doctors, but could get no relief with any of the treatments they had prescribed. Then my first grandchild was born, and I really wanted to be with the baby. I knew I had to make myself better if I was going to be able to enjoy being a grandmother. I listened to tapes, visualized, got acupuncture, ate healthy food, and took vitamins. In just 4 weeks, I was pain-free, 100%. I think the most important thing I did was to visualize more blood going to my back. That and telling myself, I really want to be healed. This concludes our Chapter 2 reading of Spontaneous Healing by Dr. Andrew Weil. This has been really pleasant to be able to reread and review these books with you. It's been really fun. If you've been enjoying the read-alongs with me, please leave a comment down below and a like, and we'll see you next time.